Thank you for joining us for our program, Liberty is Sweet, the Hidden History of the American Revolution. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. I would also like to thank the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington, ABCL, Lexington History Museums, formerly Lexington Historical Society, Lexington Human Rights Committee, Lexington Lyceum Advocates, and Native Americans in Lexington for partnering with us on this program. Finally, I'd like to thank Christine Dean and the Lexington Community Center for sharing their space with us tonight. Lex Media will be recording the event, which will be posted to the library's YouTube channel, as well as on Lex Media's site. Brian from Maxima Book Center is here if you are interested in purchasing a copy of our author's books. Brian will be in the back there. Our authors will be happy to sign them for you as well. We will have time for some questions at the end of the program. At that time, I'll bring over a microphone so everyone can hear your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Robert A. Gross is James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History, Emeritus at the University of Connecticut, a specialist in the social and cultural history of the United States from the Revolution to the Civil War. Gross focuses particularly on New England. His first book, The Minutemen and Their World, presents a community study of Concord, Massachusetts in the 18th century, portraying the internal conflicts that shaped the town's participation in the mobilization against British rule. For his innovative interpretation of the American Revolution as a socialist movement, Minutemen received the Bancroft Prize in American History in 1977. It was reissued in a 25th anniversary edition by Hill and Wang in 2001. A revised and expanded edition appeared in 2022 from Picador Books in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Welcome, Bob. I'm now going to pass the mic to you to introduce our guest this evening.
Okay, well, this will be a metaphorical mic that we have just asked. Thank you, Helen, and thanks for inviting me to be here.
Everyone here?
Yeah. You all can hear me?
Yeah.
Especially all those in your back. So I'm really impressed that barely a week has gone by. April 19th has whizzed through our two towns of Concord and Lexington, and you're not worn out. It's hearing. Will, you might want to know, maybe the public should be, what happened on the 20th and the 21st? Nobody ever wants to know, what did they do? How they clean up? What was going on? So I'm really happy to be here to introduce a good friend and distinguished colleague, Woody Holton, whom I have known, I think, since sometime in the 1980s when we met in Williamsburg, Virginia. Woody is now the chair professor, the McCaslin Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, having gone there after serving for a long time as a professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia. But before that, at Williamsburg State University in Pennsylvania. He has his BA from the University of Virginia, PhD from Duke University, and he has published in the last couple decades a number of really important books, starting with Forced Founders on the Revolution in Virginia, then Unruly Americans on debt and economic conflict and the making of the Constitution, followed by his amazing book, Abigail Adams, a biography, which won the Bancroft Prize. I should have said that the Unruly Americans was a finalist for the National Book Award. Wow. And then he recently, and we're talking about today, his book on Liberty is Sweet, A History of the American Revolution. His greatest distinction, though, is being married to Gretchen Scholl, who got her PhD in the College of William and Mary in the program that I ran, and we introduced Gretchen and Woody, and they produced marvelous children, Henry and Beverly. So I want to make sure they got credit and you bring that back home. Woody has been enormously influential in taking history as it has been done by people wanting to stress the competition among different groups in American economic and political life, but taking that competition and showing how it served to affect, shape the decisions made by the people who often studied alone, the great white males of the revolutionary elite. So his work has consistently sought to show how late 18th century and early 19th century America constitutes an arena of many contending groups and peoples, and I think that's what we'll be talking about today. So, as
Bob, all of that from memory. Pretty darn impressive.
there were no footnotes. Let me say that, as a historian of Congress, I've written and made a career on one community. A community whose residences in the Massachusetts national story are important to tell, though you in Lexington probably think they've never told too much. But I just do one town. And Woody has decided to take on the entire American Revolution. And I want to know, what it was like for you to make that choice? And what did you think you'd have to do to write a history of the whole American Revolution? And remember, it's not as if in Massachusetts, I'm parochial, focusing on Congress. This guy's from Virginia. You want to talk about parochial? They can get parochial.
We're more parochial than you are. Why did I decide to write about the whole revolution? Because I thought it would be easy. And I'm serious that I teach the American Revolution just about every single year. And it was hard at first, but then I got my lectures down and I figured, okay, all I'll have to do is write it up. And that was the dumbest decision I've ever made in my life. But it ended up being the most fun. The results of it were the most fun. And Bob, you say the whole American Revolution. You and I are learning from people younger than us that the whole American Revolution means talking about things going on in Canton, in China, and things going on in Bengal, the Bengal section of India, that Hyder Ali, I made the case, who was a rebel against the British in India, not the Bengal, but in southern central India. He influenced both why there was a revolution, because he helped bankrupt the East India Company, and therefore the Tea Act was adopted by Parliament in 1773 to try to unbankrupt them. And Hyder Ali also won another victory against the British 7 years later or so, and that led the British to say, man, we've got to pull things in and stop having so many wars. Let's start by ending the war in America. So I like to say Hyder Ali both helped start the American Revolution and helped bring it to a close as well. And so I'm very proud that I have a map here of all of the 26, as you know, there were 26 British colonies in America, right? Some of you are nodding their heads unless they're going, oh my God, how do I slip out quietly? Those who nodded helped me remember some of the others. 13 rebelled on July 2nd, 1776. What are some of the others?
Jamaica?
Exactly. Barbados. It starts to sound like Kokomo pretty soon. Nova Scotia, absolutely, is one. Newfoundland was a different one. Prince Edward Island, some of you remember from Anne of Green Gables. That was a colony, tiny colony. There were more Canadians. As if one wasn't enough, they had 2 Floridas in those days, the Bahamas and so forth. So one thing we can talk about is why the other 13 didn't rebel. But seriously, I thought, I was having trouble thinking of a topic. I'm now overflooded with topics that I'll never get to all of in this lifetime. But I couldn't think of a specific topic, and I thought I would try to
So you've got
do a whole shebang.
the geography. we haven't talked about the chronology. This is a book that goes from 1755 to 1794-95. Why those dates? Would anything spontaneously say, American Revolution happened between 1755 and 1795?
Great question. Let me answer about 1755 with an analogy that will be familiar to many of you, and that is how much the Great War of 1914 to 1918 affected that generation, those who survived the war. Just sort of everything was shaped around the war. And it turns out there was a great war for the American revolutionaries too. Not the one that they fought starting about 2 miles down the road from here, which is I never get to say, in 1775, but the one that had been fought, started by George Washington in 1754 in the area that's now Western Pennsylvania, but was contested at the time between the French and the British, but also the Native Americans who actually lived and hunted there. And what was stunning about it for me was there was one battle in particular, the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9th, 1755, and just about anybody you can name who's a general in the Revolutionary War, on the British side as well as on the American side, was at the Battle of Monongahela first. Now, 2/3 of the officers on that expedition were killed, but of the third that survived, a great many of them went on to become leaders of the revolution, and lots of names you've heard of otherwise. Well, Daniel Morgan would be one, but this was when Daniel Boone, going out west, started to hear about a place called Kentucky that maybe we should check out. And it's just stunning how it's the focal point for everything that happens in the revolution. Oh, this reminds me of that time during the Battle of Monongahela when the Indians surprised us. We just got surprised as much as we were then. It was a real touchstone for the revolution.
What about the end point, 1795?
Well, it's impossible to figure out where the American Revolution ends. I think a lot of people from the signs I saw on May Day here in Lexington and Concord, it's not over yet. And I'm not sure it should be. But so it is very arbitrary. My friend and your friend Alan Taylor finished his wonderful book called American Revolutions with an S in 1815. That is after the War of 1812. I liked ending right after the Whiskey Rebellion because that was a crucial event. It's sort of one of the main reasons the Constitution was written. I'm looking at people my age in this room. You had to memorize the preamble of the Constitution, didn't you? Mm-hmm. Anybody want to try it now? But you remember that one of those is provide for the common defense, and another is ensure domestic tranquility. And domestic tranquility might sound like sitting by the fire with your knitting, there's a golden retriever on the rug. No, domestic tranquility meant put down rebellions, whether it's Daniel Shays, about 100 miles west of right here, rebellion in 1786. The Congress at the time voted to send troops to this state, to Massachusetts, to put down Shays' rebellion, and they never took the field because there was no money. Because before the Constitution was adopted in 1787, the federal government, the federal Congress, many of you are going to like this, even in Lexington, the federal government had no ability to levy taxes. Not even tariffs. And so the Constitution created that power to and they did. Trump's right about one thing. They did fund the government off of tariffs, by and large, for the first couple hundred years. But my point is that you need the Constitution so that you have federal taxes, so that you can field an army, to provide for the common defense, but more, if you look at how they spent the money, it was fighting Indians, so it was provided for the common offense against Indians, and B, you need that money for putting down rebellions like the Whiskey Rebellion. And Indians rebelled, that's what I mentioned briefly, Indians also rebelled in the 1790s and actually defeated 2 American armies, finally lost after the Constitution was adopted and a powerful enough army under Mad Anthony Wayne went and put them down in that same period, 1794-95.
So what those dates frame is a war to expand the land that British North America would possess, taking it away from France, so that a lot of wealthy men could engage in land speculation and accommodate whites who were land hungry, taking away and intruding upon the land that had been the homes of Native people. And the book ends with putting down common people rebelling against taxes and with the defeat of Native peoples, so that landholders and speculators can once again have a party. So what he says in the book, that the Constitution is an economic document, turns out the American Revolution is in many ways an economic phenomenon. And yet the book is called Liberty is Sweet, not Free Trade is Sweet. So could you explain to people what you mean by it, and where did you get this title, Liberty is Sweet? And how'd you find it, and what's it supposed to convey to the reader?
Where did I get this title? I stole it from my dissertation advisor, Peter Wood, is one of the early writers of Black history, and he wrote an article about the 2 years or so leading up to the Declaration of Independence, and really talked about the huge role that African Americans played in that. If you look at Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, which I really recommend to you sometime, it's fascinating. I think it's not better than the final draft. He thought it was better, shockingly. He was distraught. And the reason that you can go look it up online is that he saved many copies in many places and gave to various people so that they would be around now. But his longest grievance of all the 27th was the one about the British alliance with enslaved people. He himself lost 30 slaves who went off and joined the British, most of whom died. He recovered a few of them. But my point is that Peter Wood wrote an article about the Black role in making an alliance with the British, in which Blacks got free, the British got soldiers, and it totally infuriated, as you know, many white Americans and helped push them into independence. That's why it's in the Declaration of Independence. And the title that he used for that was a quote from Lund, Washington, cousin of George Washington, running Mount Vernon while George was off running the army. And Lund said, man, we've got the British here making alliances with the slaves. A lot of slaves from here at Mount Vernon are running away. He had convict servants working for him as well at Mount Vernon. A lot of them are escaping. And he basically said, can you really blame them? Liberty is sweet. And so I use it after getting Peter's permission, I used it for my book title. The same reason he used it for his article title is that when people see it, they think, well, that must be from the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or something that Sam Adams said, but it was actually said by African Americans. And by the way, it leads to that. The problem is, to sell my book, I have to be there to explain it. And that's true of the image. I see a couple of you have it. There's an image on the cover, which there's a surprise in that image. I'm going to ask you, ma'am, since you're the only copy I do see. Come on, people. No, I don't want it. But I want you to see if you can figure out there's something unusual about one of those patriots. The patriots are the guys standing up, and the British are the guys on the horses, and there's something unusual. Actually, there's only one patriot, but there's something unusual about that patriot. See if you can figure it out. And there's a page you can turn to if you need to, but I bet you'll figure it out. Does anybody else got a copy of it? They can play this game in a second. But the point is I wanted the both the title and the cover image to confuse people. Oh, I think that must be Sam Adams. It's actually about slaves, and I think this is a British part. You get it. Go ahead.
You actually quote the phrase "liberty is sweet" at the end of the book, in which you quote Abigail Adams' brother, William Stephen Smith, as remarking on why Britain sought to bar American sailors and vessels from Caribbean ports. And his explanation was, it didn't just have to do with trade. They were worried that the Americans infected by liberty would spread the disease to people in the Caribbean islands, but implicitly perhaps the blacks. But he said the doctrine of liberty is sweet. But let me ask you, in a book that's intent on interpreting things among other things, from black people's point of view. Why did you take your title from white people commenting on the motives of black people?
Well, a fair challenge, Bob, which I appreciate. Duels at noon tomorrow?
I'm burned.
Well, I can make it. I can make it harder on myself by pointing out.
Mike.
It's a great question because it's not like we're lacking for commentary from African Americans. It's shocking how much literature does survive, writings does survive from African Americans. Many of you have heard of your fellow Massachusetts resident, Phyllis Wheatley, who was not only the first black woman, but first African American of either gender to publish a book of her poetry, and she wrote about the Revolution, and her poetry had an impact. My fellow Virginian, I'm sorry to say, I'm originally from Virginia, I'm sorry to say that, but not that part, but, because this is on tape. I'm sorry to say that he did this. He came and took over the Continental Army on July 3rd, 1775, and immediately threw out all of the African Americans. And he later switched, and Bob can tell you, as a historian, especially of Concord, but of that whole year, and many other things, that one reason that Washington changed his mind was that people like Prince Estabrook had fought valiantly at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, and he hadn't been there for any of that, but his junior officers told him about that, and that's one reason Washington changed his mind. Another reason Washington changed his mind was that Phyllis Wheatley wrote a very flattering poem about George Washington.
Well,
So somehow, if you flatter an American president, you can get whatever you want.
I'm shocked.
Talking about
Shocked
that with
to
soap
hear
and
that
water.
you need to American president to get something out of it. The reason I approached the question
No, it's a good question.
is
I can
that
answer it.
well, liberty is sweet. Why that adjective? What's on liberty? Sour? Is liberty sweet because someone was thinking about Jamaican sugar plantations? My challenge is that it seems to me it's problematic in a way that Liberty Sweet suggests, and this will lead us into the next thing in the book, Liberty Sweet suggests that liberty is a state of being exempt from the coercion and oppression, misery and confinement that is the life of most of humankind. Sweetness is an exemption, not a right. And so that one Washington wasn't remarking on how they were seizing their rights by deserting his plantation, claiming the liberty that was their due. They were seeking the exemption from the man with the whip and the man who forced them to labor.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And take it a little one step further with me that the biggest thing I think I wanted to say in using that word is the maybe obvious point, but worth repeating, that one man's liberty is another man's slavery.
Right.
That is the liberty, what was the liberty that my South Carolina ancestors fought for when they seceded in December of 1860? It was the liberty to own slaves. And so, I mean, you know, I do have a party line and certain positions that I take, but the most important thing I'd say that for me to do, both as a teacher and for both of us as authors, is to confuse people. And you know, no one likes to read it. That book is so confusing, but and seriously, this is sort of the story of my writing life. I have not written a bestseller yet. His book, he's being very modest. Is it up here? His first book, A Minute in the World, is literally an academic bestseller. And you figured out how to confuse people in a way that didn't make them stop reading. And I think that's a challenge that that's a harder challenge even than the one you gave.
So the subtitle of the book is really intriguing, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. So apparently it was a cover-up like Watergate that meant to conceal the real American history, the true American history from you. But we have an author here who's going to lift the veil and expose what's been hidden. So who hid it from us? And what are you exposing? And then we can get into the meat of what are some of the stories you expose and why are these ones you want to tell us about?
Yeah, the hidden history of the American Revolution. I hate that title.
I didn't know this.
I fought my editor over that title. And maybe we should just stay with Liberty Sweet or the American Revolution or something. Because although, all right, here's how I'll defend it, even though it's not my choice. And that is, it's hidden even if somebody didn't hide it. And I do think the process things get hidden because there's a better way of telling it that makes you look better. A lot of the myths about Columbus are conquest myths. You know, we say that he's the only one who knew the world was round. Everybody knew the world was round. The question was how big it was, and he was wrong about how big it was, and so forth. If he'd known what everyone else knew, he wouldn't have set out on his trip. And so there are conquest myths. I think there are conquest myths. Every country just about has myths about their revolution, whether you're Ghana, having rebelled in the 1960s, or India successfully in the 1940s, and successfully many times before that, us. Even England has their glorious revolution that they harken back to. And so we all should be compelled to confront our myths. Oh, but can I give an example of that?
Yeah.
From Lexington, Massachusetts. The party line for the Patriots on the night of April 19, 1775 was we didn't shoot at the British. They killed, I think it was 9 people, if you count those who later died, 9 people among the militia were killed. No British soldiers were killed here in Lexington on April 19th. And they were proud of that because they hadn't been ordered to fire. They wanted to make sure the world knew that the British had started this war. It always matters who hit me, who hit who first. And they really wanted to emphasize that. And Concord, on the other hand, was a little more advanced in that they kind of had to be because they did kill 3 British soldiers there, and then another 60 were killed on the way back to Boston. And so for the British, this was not really a battle of Lexington. None of them died. Not even really a battle of Concord because only 3 died. I think we should really call it the Battle of Route 2A because it was along the route back to Boston that so many British soldiers died. But along comes the 50th anniversary in 1826. And the party line has kind of changed since then here in Lexington because as much as we were proud to say the British started this war back in 1775, now the war has been fought and won, and we'd like a little more credit than as victims. And so people started to say, oh no, Captain Parker said, stand your ground. If they want war, let it begin here. No one had reported that, including Captain Parker at the time, but that became something to talk about in the 19th century. And my favorite part of this is there were, a few of these guys survived. Do you know that some Revolutionary War veterans lived long enough to have their pictures taken in the 1850s? There's a book of them by a guy named Hillier you can find online, The Last Men of the Revolution. Anyway, these guys are around, and they went to one guy, and he hadn't gotten the newest memo, so he recalled being on the green, that I think they call it the common that day, and that, yeah, Captain Parker told us to disband, but we could take our weapons with her, defying the British in that sense, but we disbanded, and they shot us in our back. And then, as one historian from around the year 1900 reported it, he was induced to try again. And that's when he said, oh, we fought them good. We were outnumbered, but we shot at them, and they shot at us, and it was a heck of a battle. And so I don't need to take Concord, but I am spending the night in Concord at Bob's house, so that is an example of how history gets hidden.
Yes. I thought you were going to say another thing as well, which is it was hidden in plain sight.
Oh yeah, that's a good word.
And you, as a historian, started noticing things that other people had just not seen. People don't see things for all kinds of reasons, from having their own ideological or political motivation to just inheriting a framework and not thinking to question.
Yeah, and can actually, I think it's fair pointing out that historians have biases. Okay, Woody, what are your biases?
And there occurs to me there's one in particular. I was just so astounded when I first learned 20 or so years ago. I read a wonderful book that had been published in 1961 called The Negro in the American Revolution by a black professor at a historically black college. His name was Benjamin Quarles. And he pointed out that African Americans had fought on both sides. And I was fascinated by that because it went along with something that I'd been interested in before, how ordinary people affect big events. You know, if you look at the back of your $2 bill, there's no women, no Native Americans, no African Americans, but they really did influence things. I wish Pauline Maier was still alive for so many reasons, but one, she was an MIT professor. She wrote a book on the Declaration of Independence in which she pointed out that the document signed, or not signed, but adopted on July 4, 1776 in Philadelphia was not the first such document. It was about the 90th, because a bunch of Massachusetts town meetings had previously instructed their representative to vote for it. Maryland county meetings, and then the Maryland legislature told their reps in Congress, stop voting against independence, we want you to vote for it. And she told it up to about 90, all preceding the official declaration of July 4th, 1776. So I say to my students, I don't think they know what either of these words mean. The Congress has been portrayed as the diesel engine pulling the train. Congress was actually the caboose. And so anyway, that's an interest I've long had. Quarles' book, Negro of the American Revolution, really made that point about African Americans. And also, I don't like glorifying people that I don't like glorifying anybody. I think we should not see the Declaration of Independence as a trophy, but as a challenge. How are we doing on treating everybody as though they're created equal, etc. And so I do think, well, for instance, I'm diverted, but I'll come back quick. Do you know that if most people in 1788 who could vote, which is a minority of people, if they had venerated George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Ben Franklin as much as we do today, we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights. Because the original Constitution adopted in Philadelphia, September 1787, had no Bill of Rights. It wasn't that they were against rights, they were there for other reasons and they wanted to go home. And so they said, don't worry, we don't need a Bill of Rights. A lot of the states have their own, don't worry about it. And a bunch of upstarts like Patrick Henry and right here in Massachusetts, Mercy Otis Warren, said, no, George Washington, just because you think it's fine, I don't think it's fine. And no, Alexander Hamilton, no, John Hancock, there's no insurance with you that this is going to, sorry, that this is going to work. We demand a Bill of Rights. And so I'm against venerating. And so to me, I really wanted to stress that Jefferson lost slaves. Washington, one of the slaves that Washington lost to the British, ended up in the British colony of Sierra Leone, where guess what? He led a tax revolt against the British. Harry Washington, who had been run by George Washington. And so I wanted to. So I'm against federation, and Quarles helped me with that, and I really wanted to stress that all of these heroes had slaves. A lot of them, like Washington and Jefferson, denounced it. So my point is, I think in my previous two books, when I talked about slavery, I only talked about the blacks who fought on the British side. But as many of you know, I already mentioned Prentice book, I already mentioned Peter Salem Poor, and others, there were lots of blacks on the American side as well. So I think I kind of, to quote Ron DeSantis, I was being woke when I stressed in my first two books the blacks who only fought on the British side, because about equal numbers, roughly 9,000 fought on the British side in the South, where they were not allowed to fight on the American side, and about 9,000 fought on the American side here.
That's a little misleading. Actually, 99% of blacks in Massachusetts fought on the Patriot side, and probably 99% of all enslaved and free blacks who could fight in the South fought on the British side.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't half and half. It was wholes versus wholes.
Well, I see. Yes, you're right. Overall, 18,000, roughly 18,000 for, 9 against, but you're right. The 9,000 that were for were all up here, where of course only 10% of slaves.
Right.
10% of African Americans were here, and a huge percentage of them participated in the war for a variety of reasons. But all of this, the Quarles, can I give you one quote from Quarles to tie that up, which is on this notion of liberty, and it's not quite the word he used, but and you can see Quarles is kind of being influenced by the French Revolution when he wrote this in the 1950s. Can you imagine being an African American scholar trying to get into the archives in places like Virginia and South Carolina in the 1950s to research this book? But he did it. And he said African Americans, it's not correct to call them black loyalists. A lot of people still call them the blacks in the South who fought on the British side, black loyalists. I've met some of their descendants in Nova Scotia who are known as Black Empire loyalists up there. But he said they're not black loyalists and black patriots because they were all committed not to this side or that side, but to a principle, and that principle was the rights of man.
So I'm, after reading your book, got to thinking that since the vast majority of people of color, men of color, in the North and New England served with the Patriot forces, with slavery crumbling as they served. And since the blacks who served in the armed forces in the South during the Revolution flocked to the British lines, and if they didn't die of disease while doing so, ended up gaining freedom, not in North America, at least the New United States, but in Nova Scotia or elsewhere in Canada, or in England, or in Sierra Leone, or even, as Woody said, in Australia. That means that for the overwhelming majority of black people, the American Revolutionary War was an emancipatory event.
No.
Why not? You've got the blacks who signed up to serve on the British side, and to the extent that they survived, it was then emancipatory for them. And those who were blacks in the North who signed up, actually, most of them were probably free on signing up.
So here's the reason I say no so emphatically, is that everything you said is just true for those who signed up, but there and survived the war. But you mentioned the disease, that especially Lord Dunmore was the last royal governor of Virginia, and something like 1,000 African Americans joined him, and the majority of them died in a year because he crammed them on these ships. Where they had smallpox, they actually inoculated them against smallpox, but too late, and then typhus got them, and so they were liberated only in the spiritual sense of dying during the war, and then lots of other African Americans died in the war, and go ahead, you go first.
So I'm just pushing this to be a little refractory here. It does seem to me that to the extent that we're going to emphasize people's acts and choices, they didn't choose to die in the hull of a ship, but they did choose to fight with Lord Dunmore, for Lord Dunmore, for goals of their own. In that sense, it was emancipatory.
Yeah, I see that. But let's also remember, though, let's separately remember the people who did not sign up and still died of disease, or more importantly,
In the South, the big impact of the war didn't change the internal government that much. What it did was open up the Southwest, or not Texas, what they call the Southwest, which is western Georgia, and then Alabama, Mississippi, over to Louisiana. That area might never, I mean, who knows what the British did not want people did not want colonists there. The war made it possible for colonists to go kill the Indians there and take that land. Everybody knows about the Trail of Tears, and resettle that area. So 1 million people, African Americans from North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, were sold down the river, literally, into that. And I think the revolution, played a big enough role in that has to be considered. And we also have to remember the thousands, hundreds of thousands. I kind of resisted this at first because I had sort of a pro-British bias for a while there, because they were the ones, where I lived, in freeing black people. But the British took a lot of slaves with them when they left back to the Caribbean, and have them continue to be slaves there.
So we have time for questions. I'm gonna pursue two other lines, and then we'll open things up. The first is, boy, disease plays a pretty big part in your book. We've been talking about choices people made, decisions, were they asserting their liberty, were they claiming new statuses for themselves. But actually, it turns out, there were germs that were acting independently of any human will to affect all the outcomes. I thought maybe the book should have been called Guns, Germs, and Redcoats.
Yeah. Wait till you see the next one. It's just going to be even more down that way. And I've actually think so. My next book is about the impact of disease on the revolution, and one continuous grave is one possible title, and this confounded climate is another. And I'll just mention a couple of pieces of that because, Bob, I agree. There's these diseases, these microbes, and the lice are they're just trying to survive too. I read a great book written by a guy named Zinder, who's a biologist in the room. I'm sure you've heard of it. It was a defense of lice. They were just trying to survive like everybody else. And once they've bitten somebody, they die. And so they were just trying to eat and just trying to be left alone.
Don't tell us the fifth grade teacher.
Yeah, exactly. These were much worse lice than the head lice. These are lice in the clothes. And so I've been thinking about writing that book. One of the phrases that Darwin uses in Origins of the Species, we've all heard of survival of the fittest, but he calls it a struggle to exist. And that louse is just trying to stay alive, and so is the typhus virus that's in him, and likewise with the mosquito. They're just trying to, and in the course of doing that, they kill, even during the Revolutionary War, and actually to bring it home to literally, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, now called American Ancestry, gave me the biggest gift, which is a list of all of your ancestors, if you go from Massachusetts way back, who died during the Revolutionary War, and in many cases it says why they died. And with that, I'm tracing a terrible, terrible dysentery epidemic in 1775 that killed more women than the number of men who died in 1775, and all of those battles we know. Lexington, Concord to a Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga, and so forth. So absolutely, the diseases are quietly doing their things. In this case, bacteria, just trying to produce more bacteria to reproduce themselves. That's all. The same thing that those strapping Concord boys are doing. They're just trying to reproduce themselves.
You combine germs and disease with storms, hurricanes, and the fact of geography. And by the time I was done, I thought, one of the great movements in human history that we associate with the assertion of reason and the will of organized groups and individuals, the American Revolution, turns out to be this event in which much of what happens is determined by unseen forces and unforeseen forces. And when they're not determined that way, it's by whole bunches of people colliding with one another, seeking in one way or another to survive themselves. And I thought, well, that's we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are limited and imperfect, that when they assert themselves, they can't get anywhere that they want, that others will stand in their way whenever they try. But nonetheless, they'll brag about what a great gift they gave to all humankind.
Yeah, the image you're conjuring from me is the Titanic after the iceberg. And everybody's sort of scrambling to find that piece of wood. And maybe if you found a good piece and I'm bigger than you, it's mine now.
I thought it was more like the Muppet Show, where he's Waldorf and I'm Statler.
Oh, yeah. I think we do look like them.
But seriously, it is striking.
But no, I want to make a case for human agency
You're
in all of
cutting
this.
human beings quite down to size in a book where people would think, oh, at least one moment in American history, we did something.
Oh, we did a lot. And so, yeah, let me try to, having knocked them off the pedestal a little bit, let me try to put them back on there. And first, just to quote a wonderful book by our mutual friend Elizabeth Finn called Pax Americana. And that's Pax spelled with an O, because it's about the smallpox that accompanied the revolution that killed many more people. You know, battlefield deaths in the Revolutionary War, you might want to guess the number. It's 7,000. Fewer Americans died in those 7 years of war than died in 3 days at Gettysburg. That's battlefield deaths. But if you count disease, it's 35,000, mostly as prisoners, but also in camp of all those diseases that we talked about. And so that's happening, but George Washington was not helpless in the face of that. And I think he was, we can talk about it in Q&A, questionable general in the strategic sense in the early years of the war, because he was locked in fifth gear. All he could imagine was doing was attack, attack, attack. And sometimes the best thing to do is let the enemy come to you. And we learned that here in Massachusetts at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but Washington hadn't been there for that and just hadn't had the feel. Anyway, I'm not sure he was a great general early in the war, but he was great at one thing, and that is, as Lil Fenn points out, he decided to inoculate his entire army against smallpox. And as she says, he thereby saved his army. And I had one thing from my own research was what really motivated Washington to inoculate his army was not just to save the soldiers, that was important too, but recruitment had stopped cold in the winter of 1777 because the Continental Army had gotten a reputation as a hotbed of smallpox. And the young men were willing to go die on the battlefield for their country, but they weren't willing to die of smallpox for their country. And so, and I don't mean this as cynically as it might sound, inoculating the army was a PR/recruitment move on Washington's part to make the Continental Army a more appealing place to serve. So that's an example of this uncontrollable force, the smallpox variola virus spreading around, and you can get control of it if you inoculate. And it didn't work in this case, and they just adopted the draft in 1777. But people respond. I want to talk about how farmers, I mean, ordinary soldiers responded to diseases too. But I'll let you in first.
But so, yeah, I think what you're saying is we can nonetheless write a history of how human beings try to understand and adapt to conditions that they don't create themselves,
Yeah.
but have to live with.
They
And-
are,
and as it
like
turns
good
out,
Darwinians struggling to
George,
exist too.
George Washington was a terrible strategist on paper, but he never acted on the strategy because he listened to his subordinates. He didn't attack Boston head on. He didn't attack New York or Philadelphia head on. So in that sense, you know, he's adapting rationally by taking in different views. My last question for you is this. Most of this book is a history of battles in the war and the military, not so much on the home front. And I wonder if you think that military service, and especially Continental Army service, fosters the democratization of American society.
Yes, particularly if we think of democratization along the gender divide, because men being off at war was very sad for the women whom they left behind. John Adams never went to war, but he was in Congress, and then almost as soon as he came home from Congress, went off to France as an American diplomat. And Abigail described those years as her widowhood. She was never a widow. You know, she would end up dying 6 years or 8 years before he did, but she felt like a widow, so she was wicked sad. And you can see that's one of the things that's really portrayed well in the HBO movie John Adams. On the other hand, she took over the family finances and ran them much better than John ever had. Not so much the farm, but she, when he was in Europe, she would have him basically include some stuff for her in the diplomatic pouch for her to sell, because there was a British, what do you call it, the blockade, thank you, of the Atlantic coast, and so anything that you could get through, you could sell for 3 times what it had cost before. So she made a killing first as an international merchant, and then took some of that money and speculated in government bonds that had fallen to 10 cents on the dollar, and she ended up selling them for 90 cents on the dollar. She had an uncle who advised her early on how to invest her money, and you could see her in the letters later in the war, receiving letters from him asking her advice on how to invest. And so she's a glaring example, but there are so many examples. Henry Knox's wife started off writing him saying, what do you want me to do next? This horse is sick. Asking him to micromanage while he was also in charge of artillery for the whole Continental Army. But then she starts saying, you should have let me sell that horse that I wanted to sell. And starts asserting that power. And Barrett from New Hampshire, his wife uses, a lot of you young folks here are really into pronouns. In the early days, she always referred to the farm as your farm. Your farm is not doing so well, we've had a drought. Three of your goats died. And then a couple of years in, our farm is doing okay, but we're still having goats getting sick. And then by the end of the war, she's saying, my farm is doing just fine. So I'm slight, because I think you were asking about different kinds of democratization, but certainly in terms of gender, women, it's just like Rose to the River during World War
Well,
II.
I'll give you a couple other things very quickly. One, in the northern lines of the Continental Army, black men served alongside white men getting the same pay, and some black men were subaltern officers over white men.
Yeah.
And they, in later years, when pensions became available, got qualified for their pensions, either in 1818 or 1832, which is to say they were recognized as citizens through those payments in ways that were belied by the Dred Scott decision.
Absolutely.
So, and then the other broader question is thinking again about the experience of hierarchy in the military. What was that like? How did veterans come out of it? Were there state units or county ones in which relationships between officers and the rank and file were more egalitarian than others? Military, it seems to me, history is a branch, if you will, of a social and political history in which we look at how organization is a model for authority and the structuring of power. So, and it seems to me your book lays out a lot of ways in which one can make such a case.
Yes, I would say, just as I was just saying, the revolution created both opportunities and challenges for women, unprecedented opportunities and challenges for women. Oh, and I'm going to quote our friend Mary Ferrer in a second. For women, it did that for African Americans, and it did that for ordinary white farmers as well. Amazing, unprecedented, never had before opportunities, and amazing, unprecedented had before challenges. But I want to stress the challenges part because things like not getting paid, which was the regular experience of Continental soldiers, did lead to mutinies. And there's there's draft resistance. As soon as they got the draft, they got draft resistance. And B, there were mutinies of the entire Pennsylvania line twice. And they actually got in one of those mutinies, they got what they had asked for. But to pull back to what we were talking about before, one of the biggest sources of mutiny in the Continental Army was being sent south. Soldiers from around here in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, New York, hated the idea of being sent to Virginia or South Carolina to fight. And I'm at about 7 or maybe I'm closer to 9 examples so far I've found of soldiers in various ways resisting having to march south. So for instance, Lafayette, he's coming down in early 1781 from New York with 1,000 light infantry to try to capture the traitor Benedict Arnold, who's operating in Virginia. And they're hustling to try to catch Arnold, and so they didn't bring any women with them, which means their shirts are full of lice because they don't have anybody to kill them. And they didn't know about typhus in particular, but they knew that all those bugs in their shirt could not be good for their health. And so the guys started disappearing. At muster, fewer and fewer people were there. So he did carrots and sticks. The stick was he hanged one of the soldiers and made the others watch, knowing that will happen to you next. And B, he charmed the women of Baltimore, as he put it. I'm sure they were willing to help, into making shirts for the soldiers. And so that was an example of the initiative for this problem came from lice or from the typhus bacteria, but the solution to it comes from Lafayette and the women of Baltimore. And Washington, he didn't want to come to Yorktown, Virginia in the summer of 1781. That was exactly the reaction I wanted. What? He didn't want to come to Yorktown? That's his big moment. You're right. Washington's victory at Yorktown. He didn't want to go for a couple reasons. A, he was still bent on attacking New York. And you're right, he restrained himself. But now he's got the French Navy on his side. Oh, please, please, Daddy, let me attack New York. I want to be Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, massive amphibious landing. It's going to be so cool. So there was that reason. But he had another more concrete reason for not going south, was that he was afraid his soldiers were going to mutiny. And his French colleagues said, look, we're going to go south. That's where the 28 French battleships are going to be, and that's where the French army is going to be. If you want to fight the British, you're going to have to fight it in the south. So partly, they presented him with a fait accompli, but also they lent him the money so that as every Continental soldier marched through Philadelphia on the way from up here to down there, they got something they'd never gotten in their entire 6 years of service in the Continental Army. And you are exactly right. And that was, they got paid in real money. In those days, it's the opposite of now. The good stuff, you drop a penny, you might not pick it up. In those days, the coin, the gold and silver coin, that was the real money. And you could find numerous diaries and memoirs of these soldiers saying, holy cow, we just got a month's pay in real money. Another response to disease.
I thought you were going to say they got baguettes. So before we get any more mutinies, let's open it up to questions.
I have a microphone. Let me bring it over to you.
Question about George Washington. How collegial was he?
That's a great question. A lot of these, he was not a great colleague in the First War, in the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, and as you know, in the later war, in the Revolutionary War, he started right at the top. But I think he had a lot of respect for his Council of War, which is his generals, and as Bob said, they talked him out of doing some crazy stuff. And so I would describe him. I would just say, with Washington sat down at the Council of War, and if the Secretary of Artillery said, "You are doing such a great job, Mr. Washington. We just want to praise you. You're saving America." He would have said, "Cut the crap, let's get to work."
Thank you. Thank you.
In letters that were carefully scrutinized as the recipient.
Yes.
What?
How about the hidden role of the Native Americans during the Revolution?
Oh, I really appreciate that question, because we didn't know about it at all yet, and they're all through the book, and a lot of great scholarship on them. Now, I should mention Colin Calloway, who teaches at Dartmouth. He has a wonderful book about Washington and Native Americans, but it's much beyond Washington. It really sees the Native role, which was very complex. You had people like the Catawbas living near me, and the Mohicans living near you, who fought on the American side. Many tried to stay neutral. As you know, most of the Iroquois fought on the British side, but a couple of nations of the Iroquois, also called the Haudenosaunee, fought on the American side because they had been turned into Presbyterians by a guy named Samuel Kirkland and others. And so, it's a complex story, but the place I really want to go to it is the Native Americans' role in bringing about the revolution and in bringing about my obsession with land speculators, because two things. Well, we haven't talked about the cause of the revolution at all, so let me say they were really mad in 1763. They were furious at the way the British Empire was working out. And the they I mean is not the American colonists, not any of them in any of those 26 American colonists. Most of them were pretty satisfied with, I'm talking about free people, men, were pretty satisfied with the British Empire. The people who were dissatisfied was the British Parliament, because people like John Hancock had smuggled and traded with the enemy throughout the 7 Years' War, so they were mad about smuggling. What else was Britain mad about? They were mad that the colonists kept going out and provoking wars with the Indians that the British Army had to come stop. And what's the most expensive thing governments do? Go to war. And so they were tired of that huge expense that had doubled the British debt almost. And so it's important to remember, and actually I think you guys won't mind this. My students hate it. But to try to convey what the colonists wanted all through the 60s, all they wanted through the 1760s was to go back to the way it had been. Because Britain cracked down on smuggling, cracked down on the stealing of Indian land. The Parliament drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains saying no settlement west of the mountains. And basically everything out there in the west became an Indian reservation if the British had retained control. They still enforce it in Canada, they're part of it. And so it was Britain that wanted to change things, and the colonists who were trying to just turn back the clock to how things had been in 1763. And the colonists were singing, "We just want to go back to the way we were." They were the nostalgic one. And so how this relates to Indians, I'll finally get to your question. Because of the Parliament's anger at the provoked Indian wars, they drew that line that prevented land speculators like Jefferson, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, all of those guys from speculating in Western land. And to help enforce it, the British government made this amazing decision in 1762 that they'd never done before. Many of you know there had been a lot of other colonial wars before. And after each of those wars, the British government had done what you would expect it to do, and that was to bring the boys home. And they brought most of them home after the French and Indian War in 1763, but they voted to leave 10,000 of those soldiers here. Now, 2,500 went down to the Caribbean to keep an eye on the slaves, who were 90% of the population in places like Jamaica. But the other 7,500 went to North America, many to keep down the French speakers who had just been conquered from French. As you know, they're still angry at being ruled by English speakers in Quebec today. And so some soldiers went there, but then the rest of the soldiers went to Fort Niagara, Fort Pitt, now Pittsburgh, and so forth, to try to stop Western speculation. And here's where the origins of the revolution come into this. Okay, so you've got these soldiers, they're not all over, but they're doing the best they can. These soldiers are acting as a border wall between the Indians and the colonists. And Parliament figured if we are going to build this wall between the colonists and the Indians, we're going to make the colonists pay for it. And that was the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. One thing, Bob, that this book made me do, I was angry at this book for many things, but one of the things it made me do was to read the Stamp Act. I'd taught it for years the same way everybody else taught it, which is, it seemed reasonable to the British that the colonists should help pay off the British debt, which had nearly doubled during the French and Indian War. And when you read it, it's very clear that was not what it was supposed to do at all. It was to pay for those 10,000 troops who were there to keep slaves down in the Caribbean, French speakers down in Canada, and Native Americans down here. And so one way to think about it would have been, had there been no Native Americans, had the disease that killed 90% of them killed 100% of them, or had Native Americans been as ineffective as we were taught in school that they were, then you wouldn't get this proclamation of 1763 that stopped land speculation in its tracks. And you wouldn't have gotten the Stamp Act, which was the first major thing that towns like Lexington voted to denounce in their town meetings.
There was an exhibit at Massachusetts Historical Society a few years back, in which the original Stamp Act was on view. It had been brought over from London. And it is a huge brick of the thing. That you read the whole thing, you know, you should have gotten praise among the things I learned. Read the whole Stamp Act and survived. Anybody else?
I'm blocking the name of a soldier that brought the cannons down from,
Henry Knox.
Henry Knox.
and was he a young, Henry Knox is.
He was a bookseller in Boston.
And he was
married
in his
married a
20s.
wealthy woman whose family went loyalist. But he inherited, so anyway, so that's what you're asking about. What do you want to know about Henry Knox? I don't know if I'll be able to tell you.
He was so pivotal in bringing the cannons
Yeah.
down.
He absolutely was.
Yeah, and two of his clerks were from Concord, and they were named Bliss. They were the brothers-in-law of William Emerson, the Patriot Minister of Concord. And so you had the sort of intertwine, you know, in that one Bliss Emerson family was the whole Civil War, and the Knox family, since the was it Lucy Flocker Knox,
Right.
her father had been the royal treasurer, I think, of Massachusetts.
Yes, I think that's right. But the specific thing that Knox's canon from Ticonderoga, the Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys had easily captured Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain. That was the very easy part. If you wanted to volunteer for one of that's the one you wanted, not dragging those cannon across the half-frozen lakes and so forth that they had to do that. But what that allowed Washington to do, and this is a complicated story, but let me try to give it to you. We've all heard that the British occupied Boston from Lexington and Concord basically through until March of 1776, and they famously left on Evacuation Day. What a coincidence. No, it's called Evacuation Day. Because also that, well, and you know, that's how they finally got St. Patrick's Day in Boston. We think of Boston as an Irish town. I mean, it was when we were young. But it was an anti-Irish town as a Puritan town. Puritan means get rid of purify the English church of its Catholic element. And so they resisted that and resisted any kind of celebration of St. Patrick's Day. But A, you had some Protestants from Ireland who also wanted to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And B, someone figured, wait a minute, it's March 17th. We could just call it Evacuation Day, and the Catholics can go drink to St. Patrick, and we'll drink to George Washington. But Washington would not have succeeded at that without Knox supplying the cannon that were put atop Dorchester Heights and that caused the British to leave. The complicated part of this is that that's not at all what Washington had intended. And when the British left, John Hancock commissioned a portrait of him. Harvard gave him an honorary degree, the only college degree that Washington ever got.
Yeah.
Everyone was so excited, except Washington, whose word for what happened was disappointment. Because he had not meant to shoo the British out of Boston. He had meant to attack them in Boston and defeat them, and he thought that would end the war. But they'd been planning to leave anyway. And so he did eventually realize, okay, take the win. They were going to leave anyway. Everyone thinks I forced them to win. And he certainly encouraged them to go quicker than they would have. In fact, people in Boston were saying, God, they left so much equipment. I've never seen this much equipment left on a battlefield since the Battle of Monongahela in July 9th, 1755. So he realized eventually that he should take the win. But at that point, you're absolutely right. He eventually became somebody who constantly wanted to attack the British but never did. But the one time he would have attacked them if they hadn't run away was at Dorchester Heights. And so, but he learned the lesson without
It's
that.
hard to be in the Battlefield Hall of Fame if you've never won a battle.
That's what he said. But you know, he goes and tours the town of Boston. He already had smallpox, so he was one of the first people allowed in. And he sees it.
you know, you've seen Les Miserables, you know, with those barricades. The British had that, plus what you could, you know, you could fire a cannonball from a cannon, but you could also fill it with metal and shoot all of that metal out of there at once. It turns into a giant shotgun that you could kill 20 people with one shot. And the British were set up for that. And he said, you know, the town is almost impregnable. And so,
Yes.
when his superior, his officers had persuaded him not to attack Boston all that time, they'd saved Boston, but they'd also saved him. And one of his, it was a guy on his side, who also was touring Boston, and said, the good Lord has saved General Washington when he would have killed himself, when he would have ruined himself.
Is there anybody else?
So similar to the stand back thing, you both spoke about history hidden in plain sight. And I'm just curious if there was any other story or document that you came across that you were able to look at in a way that you hadn't before as you were putting everything in context, where anything just sort of clicked and you thought, oh my God, I've never thought about it this way before.
Didn't think about that, but you're reminding me that I'm almost answering your question by coming back to this picture. I saw,
She had an idea that it's a woman.
and she's right. So the rest of you won't be as surprised because you have, I see you guys are kind of getting that too.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
did you
fine.
figure it out also?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
So people eventually figure it out. I didn't though. I asked a friend of mine who runs a library in DC, you know, can you find me some paintings of women in the Revolution? And she sent me this, and I said I wanted one of women. And she said, look again. So this is certainly one document that comes out in a different light. Oh, I'll tell you one, the Declaration of Independence. I've actually, oh, sorry. So the document that I'll choose as seeing in a different light now is the Declaration for a couple of reasons. One is I was stunned to discover, and I wish I could say I noticed this reading the Declaration myself, but Julian Boyd, who was the founding editor of the Jefferson paper, sort of the definitive edition of all letters he wrote and got back, pointed out, read the Declaration of Independence and find a denunciation of monarchy. Find Jefferson and Congress saying anything in the Declaration of Independence against the idea of having a king, and you will not find a single word on that subject. Now, if you read Common Sense, which Thomas Paine had written 6 months earlier, it's all about how bad and stupid and unchristian monarchy is, but there's nothing anti-monarchy in the Declaration of Independence, and that's true for a couple of reasons. One is that some of those guys like John Adams, they were not so sure a king was such a bad idea. They hated the current British government, the current British king, and of course the Declaration of Independence does denounce him dozens of times in that one document, but not monarchy itself. The other reason to not denounce monarchy in the Declaration of Independence is the Declaration of Independence, among other things, was an invitation. And the invitation was addressed to Louis XVI, the King of France, saying, please come help us. And so you can't denounce monarchy in there if you're going to send it to a king. And by the way, that was its main goal, was to get restore order in America and to attract the British, to attract the French army to come help win the war, which they crucially did later. But in that respect, people thought if we declare independence early enough in the summer of 1776, the French Navy will be here by August of 1776. As you know, it actually took 2 more years before the French came in. So in that initial respect, the Declaration of Independence was a failure. But here's where it succeeded. Congress had intended only to declare themselves free and independent states. They put that in all caps twice in their culminating paragraph. But as you all know, a kind of phrase that they yada through in the beginning was all men are created equal. And anti-slavery people, starting with a Connecticut man named Lemuel Haynes, and then Benjamin Banneker, and other anti-slavery, both of them were mixed race, but black, white, mixed race. They basically shifted the spotlight of the Declaration of Independence. Congress had focused it on
free independent states. In that sense, the Declaration of Independence was people don't like hearing this from a white guy from South Carolina, it was an ordinance of secession. It was a states' rights document. That is the right of these 13 states to break away from the other 13 British American states and from Britain back home too. It's a states' rights document, but all those anti-slavery people, by constantly quoting created equal when nobody else was, they transformed this ordinance of secession into a universal declaration of human rights. So that's the document that really got changed in my head, because I think it got changed for all.
And that sounds like a terrific note to go out on. A Declaration of Independence intended for pragmatic purposes, instrumental goals, could nonetheless sort of accomplish its short-term objectives, but leave us with a big legacy in the long term.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll be around, so if anybody has more questions.
They'll be around, they'll sign books, they'll sign more than one book if you want to buy them. And I'll be around to scribble my name too. Thank you.